uh, we're going to look tonight at what the Guardian says about what is distinct about the Baha'i theory of governance, as opposed to what we're seeing in America. For while we certainly should, as American citizens, be glad we live in a country that is at least uh, based on principles of justice and freedom and equality, uh, that it's not the ultimate theory of governance that Baha'is believe will lead the way to the unity of the planet or even unity of nation states. So we're going to start with a little review that I did, or an exercise that I did in a college class. It was called Senior Seminar, and it was a very interesting, exciting class to do. It was without credit, so they either passed or failed, and I told them the only way they could fail is if they didn't come to class. So they had to come to class, but they didn't have to do anything. But it was a consultation. We'd sit in a circle. We had different subjects for each one: the equality of men and women, as one example, and so on. And one of the exercises we did towards the end of the course was governance. And of course, I not unsubtly would have the last class be on the Baha'i Faith, as if not a solution, at least a nice theory they could consider about the resolution of all the problems that we had discussed throughout, or all the issues we had discussed, whether it was racism or nationalism and so on. And so one exercise I did in the next to last class was, I said, okay, we live in this country. We think it's set up soundly. The founding fathers put a lot of energy into making it, if not impenetrable, at least secure from very obvious kinds of incursion or usurpation of power. So we have of course, the separation of powers of the three main bodies of the judiciary, the executive, and then the congressional, the bicameral congressional divisions of government. And so I said, now, if we tonight, and it was a 3-hour class, I said, if we tonight could, just by our own decisions, change something about the way this operates, what logical recourse do you think would be advisable for us to take? And so I'm going to share with you some of the things they came up with. I would sometimes subtly lead them, but not much. And here's what they came up with. And these were people, it was a senior seminar because they had all gone off on their different curricula that they were pursuing, their different, they were now engineers or English majors or whatever. And now they were together for one last time. They'd started off as, not divided, and now they were divided into various vocations and so on. So here was sort of a last time for them to say, okay, here's what I've learned about this subject. And it was a wonderful sharing. And so the first thing they would come up with is this isn't in priority of order. These are just some of the things they come up with. Get rid of political parties. Why must there be different parties? Why can't there just be representatives of the different parts of the United States? So that was one thing. No lobbying. This was perhaps the first one that would come up, the most obvious. Why should we allow people to invest money in trying to perpetrate their own vested interest by cozying up to our elected representatives? fact, we would usually come up with the idea that they should be not have access to them, that this would be illegal for someone to try to influence the opinion. And so the question would come up, well, how are they going to know the ins and outs of the problem at hand? And I said, I wouldn't say it, but people would come up with the idea they could have some neutral committee knowledgeable about the issue that would give them advice, and then the decision would be made. And of course, I was modeling this after the whole sequence of consultation that's described in the Baha'i writings. You know, first you get the information, then you find out the spiritual principles, then you consult, and then you come to hopefully a unified opinion. If not, then you have a vote. So no contributions to candidates, which is similar to no lobbying, but something a little bit different. But that makes absolutely no sense, that the candidate who has the most money backing him or her is likely to win because they have the most access to advertising and public appearances. No electoral college. Now, this is something that was one of the first things, certainly. It's totally, its original implementation, as I'm sure most of you know, had to do with the problem of communication back when it was originally devised, and getting information from one part of the country to another. So there was no systematic way of having one person, one vote, so that you would simply use the plurality or the majority of votes. So we now can do that. I mean, very easily we could do that. So you don't worry about how to apportion numbers of the Electoral College to the states. You simply say who got the most votes. Make division of powers really divided. And this is interesting, and that is we have the division of powers, and yet we have the president nominating the Supreme Court, which means he, as we have just seen happen, and we've seen it all through the politics of the United States, that you have one division imposing its will on selecting those who will uphold another division, which means they're not really separate anymore. So that was another thing. A tribunal rather than an individual, a single individual. And here, this didn't come up in most classes. In most classes, we would stick with, okay, we got a president. But we would find out some way where, instead of running for office, and of course I was getting here into the Baha'i concept that we don't have nominations or electioneering, that some committee or something would select individuals they thought capable of running the country or being leaders, and then they would all have equal access to media and to our finding out about them. But then also a tribunal. Now, a tribunal, of course, originally meant 3 individuals, but it's come to more broadly mean a body that would be a executive body rather than just 3 individuals. A consultative process rather than an adversarial process, and that is the discussion of a bill or a law or a decision about going to war or whatever. Instead of having, again, once you've got through got rid of the parties, that you would have a consultative process rather than adversarial. The same kind of problem we have in our judicial system, where you have the prosecution and the defense. Well, really, the best way to come to a just conclusion would be everyone trying to find out the truth. And so this also applies, even though we're not getting into that at this point, the concept of judicial systems. Term limits, and of course, you have term limits with presidents. They can serve 2 terms, but you have none with the other bodies, either the congressional bodies or the Supreme Court. This was something that people came up with very immediately, because you have people, just living off of this, what becomes really not so much their dedication to the Republic as a pretty easy way of making a living. And believe me, they get paid well. So what we're going to look at now is we look at the Baha'i theory about all this, and it's just the theory. We're only at the very end going to look at the specifics. In another course, or take more than one course, we'll show how the administrative order of the Baha'i Faith is constructed and envisioned for the future. Because even though in the World Order Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi describes some of the ingredients of what will become the secular government of the lesser peace, he also describes elsewhere what the Baha'i model of governance will be in the golden age of Baha'u'llah. And this is taken from pages 151 through 155, though it's not all of it. It's some particular readings that I think are particularly important to note. And then we'll have a discussion. So we won't take too long on this, and this will leave us a lot of time to discuss what the Guardian's talking about. So he begins in the middle of a discussion about the World Order Baha'u'llah with this statement: a word should now be said regarding the theory on which this administrative order is based and the principle that must govern the operation of its chief institutions. It would be utterly misleading to attempt a comparison between this unique, this divinely conceived order and any of the diverse systems which the minds of men at various periods of their history have contrived for the government of human institutions. Now, again, this is important because it's all right up front. The Guardian says this theory is unlike anything that's been conceived before. And so while we see all of these laudatory statements by Abdu'l-Baha and the Guardian about the future of America and its destiny to lead the world spiritually, there is very explicit statements. There are explicit statements by the Guardian that the present form of government will not be that form. In other words, we're talking spiritually, not because we have devised a system of government that is one that should endure. He goes on to say, the Baha'i Commonwealth of the future, and this next phrase is so important, of which this vast administrative order is the sole framework. In other words, the only system that in any way prefigures what will happen in the future, is what the Baha'i Faith is right now. And this is written in 1934. But of course, the Guardian knew what he was constructing, because it was his job to finish building it, namely to create the national communities and the national spiritual assemblies, which in the future would be the secondary houses of justice, which are the electors. The electoral bodies are the pillars, as the Guardian calls them, of the Universal House of Justice. No form of democratic government, no system of autocracy or of dictatorship, whether monarchical or republican, no intermediary scheme of a purely aristocratic order, nor even any of the recognized types of theocracy. So it's not a theocracy. Or at least not any of the recognized form. There are theocratic elements in it, but it's not a theocracy as it's commonly understood, whether it be the Hebrew Commonwealth or the various Christian ecclesiastical organizations or the imamate, and of course, that's what we've in the midst of discussing, are the caliphate in Islam. So you've got, he's alluding here to both Shiism and the imamate, are Sunnism, the Sunni sect of Islam, the Caliphate. None of these can be identified or be said to conform with the administrative order which the master hand of its perfect architect has fashioned. This newborn administrative order incorporates within its structure certain elements which are to be found in each of the three recognized forms of secular government, without being in any sense a mere replica of any one of them, and without introducing within its machinery any of the objectionable features which they inherently possess. It blends and harmonizes, as no government fashioned by mortal hands has yet accomplished, the salutary truths which each of these systems undoubtedly contains, without vitiating the integrity of those God-given verities on which it is ultimately founded. Now that's important that you see that. So in other words, you can say, well, the Baha'i administrative order is like this or like that. No, it takes some of the more salutary truths in each of them, some of the devices like elements of a republic, elements of a democracy, elements of hereditary inheritance insofar as was utilized in kingships and so on. The administrative order of the faith of Baha'u'llah must in no wise be regarded as purely democratic in character, inasmuch as the basic assumption which requires all democracies to depend fundamentally upon getting their mandate from the people is altogether lacking in this dispensation. And what he explains what he means by that, but basically the electors, those elected to serve, are not dependent on, well, what do my people want me to do? So even though they're elected to represent a certain territory or a certain state, in the case of the United States, they don't ask their representatives, whom do you want me to vote for? Or for the National Spiritual Assembly, or what do you want me to propose to the National Spiritual? No. In the conduct of the administrative affairs of the faith, in the enactment of the legislation necessary to supplement the laws of the Kitab-i Aqdas, the members of the Universal House of Justice, it should be borne in mind, are not, as Baha'u'llah's utterances clearly imply, responsible to those whom they represent, nor are they allowed to be governed by the feelings, the general opinion, and even the convictions of the mass of the faithful, or of those who directly elect them. So in other words, those who elect the secondary houses of justice are not bound to vote for any particular people or propose any particular concepts or courses of action for the secondary houses of justice, and the secondary houses of justice that elect the House of Justice have no influence on what the House of Justice will undertake and what decisions it will derive. They are to follow in a prayerful attitude the dictates and promptings of their conscience. They may indeed must acquaint themselves with the conditions prevailing among the community, must weigh dispassionately in their minds the merits of any case presented for their consideration, but must reserve for themselves the right of an unfettered decision. And this is a quote from Baha'u'llah: God will verily inspire them with whatsoever he willeth, is Baha'u'llah's incontrovertible assurance. And of course, as we will see in our study of the links in the covenant, and we will study the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, we will see that Abdu'l-Baha makes it inescapably clear that what is meant by that is that they have infallibility conferred upon them by Baha'u'llah. Nor can the Baha'i administrative order be dismissed as a hard and rigid system of unmitigated autocracy, or as an idle imitation of any form of absolutistic ecclesiastical government, whether it be the papacy, the imamate, or any other similar institution, for the obvious reason that upon the international elected representatives of the followers of Baha'u'llah has been conferred the exclusive right of legislating on matters not expressly revealed in the Baha'i writings. Neither the guardian of the faith nor any institution apart from the International House of Justice, and that's what he called it at this time in 1934, not in every instance, can ever usurp this vital and essential power or encroach upon that sacred right. Very powerful and very clarifying. So even the guardian, should he have lived long enough to serve as he was designated to in the will and testament as the president of the Universal House of Justice, he would have had no more say-so in their decisions or their decision-making process than any other member. He would have simply been the convener. The abolition of professional priesthood with its accompanying sacraments of baptism, of communion, and of confession of sins, the laws requiring the election by universal suffrage of all local, national, and international houses of justice, the total absence of episcopal authority with its attendant privileges, corruptions, and bureaucratic tendencies are further evidences of the non-autocratic character of the Baha'i administrative order and of its inclination to democratic methods in the administration of its affairs. Now, we could spend a good hour talking about what that means, but the sense of it, I think, is clear. Nor is this order identified with the name of Baha'u'llah to be confused with any system of purely aristocratic government, in view of the fact that it upholds, on the one hand, the hereditary principle and entrusts the guardian of the faith with the obligation of interpreting its teachings, and provides, on the other, for the free and direct election from among the mass of the faithful of the body that constitutes its highest legislative organ. So aristocratic in its purest form from Aristotle refers to a government by, and same thing with the Platonic concept of the, as he expresses in the Republic, the aristocracy in that philosophical context meant ruled by the best. And by the best, Socrates meant, and we presume Plato, his author, also meant the best in spirit and mind, those who were the most intelligent and the most spiritual. But we're not trying to identify those who are most, in our own minds as electors we do, whom do we think is best to serve? But we don't presume that we've got the person with the highest IQ or the one who's had the most courses in Middle Eastern religions. We're talking about a totally different concept. So the concept of aristocracy in its original pure form or in its more recent form of those of the upper class, neither apply. The admitted evils inherent in each of these systems he's mentioned, being rigidly and permanently excluded, this unique order, however long it may endure and however extensive its ramifications, cannot ever degenerate into any form of despotism, of oligarchy, or of demagogy, which must sooner or later corrupt the machinery of all man-made and essentially defective political institutions. Well, there may be some who feel like, well, geez, we just came close to losing our democracy with the invasion of the capital and people of these very specific views wishing to impose their views on others, or feeling that their own views were being ignored. We see how delicate, and many of those commenting on this, the politicians themselves, said that they understood that how delicate, how fragile democracy is. And of course, many quoted the Benjamin Franklin quote, democracy is a wonderful form of government if you can keep it, if you can maintain it, words to that effect. And of course, the fact is we see that we may not be able to. Dearly beloved friends, significant as are the origins of this mighty administrative structure and however unique its features, the happenings that may be said to have heralded its birth and signalized the initial stage of its evolution seem no less remarkable. How striking, how edifying the contrast between the process of slow and steady consolidation that characterizes the growth of its infant strength and the devastating onrush of the forces of disintegration that are assailing the outworn institutions, both religious and secular, of the present day. So how distinct, he says. And of course, he was talking in 1934, before I believe he had even devised the first teaching plan, which I think was 1937. But in any case, he had, without knowing it beforehand, been appointed guardian of an institution which, though hinted at in the Agdas, did not officially exist until the creation of that institution by Abdu'l-Baha in his will and testament. So the three new institutions created by Abdu'l-Baha were the guardianship, the hands of the cause, and the National Spiritual Assembly, the second level. And so instead of a local level, which many thought after the death of Abdu'l-Baha, well, now let's elect the House of Justice. And Abdu'l-Baha in his wisdom saw that you don't have a global body representative of the human body politic to take that step. You need a secondary level of institution. And so that's what the context is that the Guardian is talking in. Look how slow this is developing, age by age, and how far we have to go, because now we have to go through the lesser piece in order to get to the most great piece. Compare these splendid manifestations of the spirit animating this vibrant body of the faith of Baha'u'llah with the cries and agony, the follies and vanities, the bitterness and prejudices, the wickedness and divisions of an ailing and chaotic world. Witness the fear that torments its leaders and paralyzes the action of its blind and bewildered statesmen. How fierce the hatreds, how false the ambitions, how petty the pursuits, how deep-rooted the suspicions of its peoples, how disquieting the lawlessness, the corruption, the unbelief that are eating into the vitals of a tottering civilization. Might not this process of steady deterioration, which is insidiously invading so many departments of human activity and thought, be regarded as a necessary accompaniment to the rise of this almighty arm of Baha'u'llah? Might we not look upon the momentous happenings which, in the course of the past 20 years, and I inserted in there what those years would have been, that would have covered the First World War and the aftermath, and of course the unfortunate Treaty of Versailles. It was not the Treaty of Versailles, excuse me, but the remuneration and so on, the heavy weight of reparation that was placed upon countries so that it immediately set up another war, and the Guardian could foresee that. Have so deeply agitated every continent of the earth, as ominous signs simultaneously proclaiming the agonies of a disintegrating civilization and the birth pangs of that world order, that ark of human salvation that must needs arise upon its ruins. Now, of course, a lot's changed since the Guardian wrote this in 1934. We had a period after World War II where we were sure, even as we were with Wilson's attempt to create the League of Nations after World War I, that we had with the United Nations created in 1946, the year after the end of World War II, what we thought would be a device to prevent any further world wars. And we even had in the, as recently as 2 decades ago, the sense that globalism was upon us, that you even had the first President Bush saying, we have a new world order. And I remember how excited we were as Baha'is when we heard him utter this phrase that was taken, we thought, directly from the writings. And even when he had waged the war upon Iraq, when they invaded Kuwait, he first got the assistance of all the other countries, and the House of Justice congratulated him on that, because he was employing one of the essential tools that we've already discussed, that was in the advice of Baha'u'llah to the world leaders in his day, and that's the concept of collective justice. Should a nation rise against another, all the other nations coalesce together to form an expression of justice and crush that nation or stop that nation. And so Baha'is at that time thought, or many thought, that maybe we can avoid this ordeal and sort of slip into the lesser peace without having to go through any dire consequences. Well, of course, in the last decade, that whole concept of globalism has become disparaged, and people have, peoples of the world, nations of the world, have retracted into a form of nationalism again. But now with the pandemic, we're suddenly from an unforeseen force forced to think of ourselves as one community suffering from one and the same illness, which is both quite literal and extremely metaphorical. Well, that's the end of the statements by Shoghi Effendi. And before we go into our discussion about this, I wanted to show you something we're going to get into in great detail in the future. And that is this administrative order, which he says is the only institution that simulates what the future world order will be like. And so for the book I did, that I published about a year or two ago, God's Plan for Planet Earth and for Your Neighborhood, I had a series of graphs or charts showing the Baha'i administration as it evolved over time. The main purpose of that was to show that while the local community had remained more or less the same since the time of Abdul Baha, the upper echelon of that administrative order had changed mightily. And so what we ended up with was this. Now, I've got a much prettier version of this in the book that Nilüfer Gordon, my editorial assistant and spiritual guide, created for me, but it didn't show up well on this. So, and I'm not sure you can even read this, but what you see is the 3 levels of institutions: the local spiritual assembly, which here will become the local House of Justice. You've got the secondary spiritual assembly, House of Justice, which are the pillars worldwide that elect the Universal House of Justice. But notice you have here, you've got two branches of administration. You've got what I call the learned, or what Baha'u'llah called the learned, and then you've got what Baha'u'llah called the rulers. Each is necessary, and we're going to discuss this in such great detail, and it'll be a joy. So you'll see how from the individual level, remember we discussed the definition of faith as defined by Abdu'l-Baha as knowledge coupled with action. And of course, you've got that in the Kitab-i Aqdas. You've got the recognition of the source of authority, and you learn from the teachings, and then you put that into a daily regimen. So knowledge and action. And so these other institutions are ancillary for now. The regional Baha'i councils have no legislative function other than overseeing the regional training institute boards. So for the last 20 years, we've had this, and this is how they all relate insofar as the teaching of the cause and the administration of the cause is concerned. The dark lines, the solid lines represent authority. So you have the National Assembly oversees the board, which is also overseen by the regional councils. The local assembly oversees the community, and the individual Baha'is elect the National Assembly, which oversees the local spiritual assemblies and so on. I'll print this out for you or share this with you in my online site on YouTube and my online website so that you can get a better sense of it. And as I say, we're going to describe how this evolves over time and which of these are permanent and which of these are evolving. But this is what the Guardian was talking about when he said, look how gradually this solid institution is evolving. So I thought we'd end with a nice picture of one of the ultimate expressions of the institution that we know will endure from now on. Because another thing the Guardian says that we've already looked at, but we're going to look at it some more, is that the administrative order is devised by Baha'u'llah is, insofar as planetary governance is concerned, the highest form or the most perfect form of governments. So we know that what Baha'u'llah has designed, that's it. It will be refined, and there will be no doubt things added to it and so on. But in the same way that the model of the family refines over time, you always have the family as an enduring and everlasting unit. The same thing with the community or neighborhood. It has been refined and redefined over time, but there'll always be a community, because while we as Baha'is have a global perspective, we live locally, and that's true with everyone, isn't it? We may think in global terms, but our felicity, our happiness, and our actions are carried out on the local level.